At 64, Meg Ryan is no longer the carefully polished image that once defined her. Time has a way of reshaping not just appearances, but narratives too. For decades, her name carried a story that seemed already written by others. One of romance, betrayal, and a sudden fall from grace. It was a story repeated so often that it hardened into something people accepted as fact. But when she finally began to speak more openly about that chapter of her life, what emerged was not scandal in the way the world had imagined, but something quieter, more complicated, and far more human. There was a time when Meg Ryan seemed almost untouchable. She represented something rare in Hollywood, a sense of warmth that audiences trusted instinctively. When she appeared on screen, people expected to feel something genuine. Her performances didn't just entertain, they reassured. She became the face of love stories that felt accessible, grounded, and real, even when they were wrapped in cinematic fantasy. That connection with audiences didn't happen by accident. It was built slowly, role by role, until her presence alone could carry an entire film. But success at that level comes with a cost. The more beloved someone becomes, the less room they have to be flawed in public. Expectations grow, and eventually they become impossible to meet. Behind the scenes, while her career was soaring, her personal life was far more fragile than anyone realized. Her marriage had already begun to show cracks long before the public ever noticed. Those closest to her understood that things were not what they appeared to be, but the outside world only saw the image. Two successful actors, a family, a life that seemed complete. By the time she met Russell Crowe, the reality of her situation was already shifting. Their connection didn't arrive in the middle of a happy, stable life. It came at a moment when things were already unraveling. But that context was lost almost immediately. What the public saw instead was a simplified version of events, one that fit neatly into a familiar narrative. It was easier to believe in a sudden betrayal than to understand the slow, painful breakdown of a relationship that had been struggling for years. The film set where they met became more than just a workplace. Long hours, emotional scenes, and the strange isolation that comes with filming in distant locations can create an intensity that's hard to replicate anywhere else. In that environment, connections can form quickly and feel deeper than they might under normal circumstances. What developed between them was real, but it was also shaped by timing, circumstance, and vulnerability. When photos surfaced of the two together, the reaction was immediate and unforgiving. Headlines didn't ask questions. They made declarations. The story was framed in a way that left little room for nuance. She was cast as the one who had broken something sacred, while he became the outsider who had stepped into a life that wasn't his. It didn't matter what the truth was, or how complicated the situation might have been. The narrative had already taken hold. What made it even more difficult was how quickly public perception shifted. The same audience that had embraced her for years suddenly seemed to turn away. The qualities that once made her relatable were overshadowed by a single storyline that refused to fade. In Hollywood, image is everything, and once it changes, it's incredibly hard to recover. Opportunities began to shift. Roles that might have once come easily no longer did. The industry, which had once celebrated her, started to move on. For a long time, she chose not to fight that narrative directly. Silence can sometimes feel safer than trying to correct a story that people have already decided to believe. But silence also allows those stories to grow, to evolve into something even more distant from reality. Over the years, as she spoke in interviews, small pieces of the truth began to emerge. She didn't present herself as perfect or without fault. Instead, she described a situation that had been misunderstood from the beginning. She explained that her marriage had been over in all the ways that mattered long before the world noticed. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was something that had been slowly fading. By the time her relationship with Russell Crowe began, she was already navigating the aftermath of something that had ended emotionally, even if it hadn't yet ended publicly. That distinction may seem subtle, but it changes everything about how the situation is understood. The relationship itself was intense but brief. It carried the kind of energy that often comes from two people meeting at a moment of transition. There was excitement, but also uncertainty. The pressure surrounding them didn't help. Constant attention, speculation, and the weight of public judgment made it difficult for anything real to grow in a stable way. What might have been a private connection instead became a public spectacle. Distance also played a role. Their lives existed in different places, with different rhythms and commitments. Maintaining something meaningful under those conditions is challenging even without the added pressure of global scrutiny. Over time, the intensity that had drawn them together began to shift. What remained was a sense that the relationship had served a purpose in a particular moment, even if it wasn't meant to last. Looking back, she has described that period not just as painful, but also as strangely liberating. Being placed under such harsh judgment forced her to confront something fundamental. The realization that public opinion, no matter how loud, does not define personal truth. It's a difficult lesson to learn, especially when the consequences are so visible. But once it takes hold, it can change how a person moves through the world. There's a moment she once recalled that captures this shift. Walking into a public space and feeling the weight of everyone's attention, she expected to feel ashamed or overwhelmed. Instead, she found herself reacting in an unexpected way. She laughed, not because the situation was amusing, but because she suddenly understood that the power others seemed to have over her existed only if she allowed it. That realization marked a turning point. In the years that followed, she stepped away from the spotlight. It wasn't a dramatic exit, but a gradual decision to focus on other parts of her life. After spending so much time being defined by public perception, she needed space to reconnect with her own sense of identity. That meant exploring interests beyond acting, spending time with family, and simply living without constant scrutiny. Her absence from the screen led to more speculation. People wondered why someone who had once been so prominent would choose to step back. Some assumed it was because of the scandals. Others believed it was due to changing trends in Hollywood. The truth, as she has described it, was simpler. She needed time to think, to grow, and to exist outside of the expectations that had shaped her career for so long. When she eventually returned to filmmaking, it was on her own terms. The project she chose reflected a different perspective, one shaped by experience rather than image. She wasn't trying to recreate what had come before. Instead, she seemed more interested in telling stories that felt authentic to where she was in her life. That shift may not have brought the same level of commercial success, but it carried a different kind of fulfillment. As for her connection with Russell Crowe, it has settled into something far less dramatic than the headlines once suggested. Time has a way of softening even the most intense experiences. What remains is not scandal, but memory. Both have spoken about each other with a level of respect that contrasts sharply with the way their relationship was once portrayed. It's a reminder that the truth of any situation often exists far away from the version that gets amplified. At 64, Meg Ryan's willingness to reflect on that chapter of her life doesn't come across as an attempt to rewrite history. Instead, it feels like an effort to reclaim it. There's a difference between denying what happened and offering a fuller understanding of it. She has chosen the latter, even if it means revisiting a time that was deeply challenging. What makes her story resonate now is not the scandal itself, but the way she has navigated its aftermath. She didn't respond with dramatic statements or public battles. Instead, she allowed time and perspective to reshape the narrative. In doing so, she demonstrated something that often gets overlooked in celebrity culture: the ability to endure misunderstanding without losing a sense of self. There's also something telling about how the conversation around her has evolved. The same events that once defined her are now seen through a different lens. People are more willing to consider the complexities that were ignored before. That shift doesn't erase what happened, but it does create space for a more balanced understanding. In many ways, her story reflects a broader truth about how quickly public figures can be reduced to a single moment. Years of work, talent, and connection can be overshadowed by one chapter that becomes impossible to escape. But it also shows that those narratives are not permanent. With time, they can change, especially when the person at the center of them chooses to speak honestly. Meg Ryan's voice today carries a different tone than it once did. There's less concern about how things will be received and more focus on simply expressing what feels true. That shift is subtle but significant. It suggests a level of confidence that comes not from external validation, but from internal clarity. The story that once followed her so relentlessly has not disappeared, but it no longer holds the same power. It has become just one part of a much larger life, rather than the defining feature of it. And perhaps that is the most meaningful outcome of all. Not the correction of every misconception, but the ability to move forward without being controlled by them. In the end, what she has broken her silence about is not just an affair, but the experience of being misunderstood on a massive scale. It's about the gap between reality and perception, and the resilience required to live within that gap. Her perspective doesn't demand agreement or forgiveness. It simply offers a more complete picture.